Today we are talking exposure. How do you set your settings to make sure that your shot is not too underexposed or overexposed? Now before we go into technique, it's best that you understand the term dynamic range. To keep things simple, dynamic range is your camera's ability to capture highlight and shadow detail. A better camera can capture details in a blown out sky better than a cheaper camera can. There are three kings of exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. All three of these will brighten up or darken your image, but they will also affect your shot in different ways. Let's start with number one, aperture. Aperture is measured in f-stops, which is this number right here. The aperture measures how much light hits your sensor by physically opening and closing the iris of the lens. The higher the f-stop, the more closed up the iris is, letting in less light, and the lower the f-stop, the more open the iris is, letting in more light. At the same time, the aperture will determine how shallow of a depth of field you get, or how blurry the background is. The lower the aperture, the more blurry the background, and the higher the aperture, the less blurry the background. Your lens will determine how low of an aperture that you can get. Cheaper lenses can generally go down to about an f-stop of 4.0, whereas more expensive lenses can go down to f1.4. Typically, I shoot in low apertures because I want that shallow depth of field, but I will occasionally shoot in higher apertures whenever the environment is really bright, like on a sunny day, and I will also do this if I want the starburst effect on blown out lights. Number two, let's focus on shutter speed, which is this number right here. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. For example, 1/48th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, etc. The higher your shutter speed, the darker your image, and the lower the shutter speed, the brighter the image. Shutter speeds also affect your motion blur. The lower shutter speed, the more motion blur, and the higher the shutter speed, the less motion blur. And number three, let's take a look at ISO, this number right here. ISO basically refers to your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher your ISO, the brighter your image, and the lower your ISO, the darker the image. However, ISO is what can easily destroy your image if you don't monitor it well, because the higher the ISO, the more grain you introduce into your footage. You want to typically keep your ISO as low as possible, preferably not above 800 ISO in most cameras. Now obviously other cameras do better with grain and higher ISOs, but either way ISO should always be used as a last resort in terms of exposure. Alright, I know that was a lot of information, but let's give you guys a starting point. Your shutter speed should always be double your frame rate. 24 frames a second, 48 shutter speed. 60 frames a second, 1/20th shutter speed, and then adjust your ISO accordingly. Shutter speeds on standard DSLR cameras tend to not go into really specific numbers, so just use the shutter speed that is closest to your desired number. Now let's take a look at one of the most important tools, the histogram. This tool is used to help you read your exposure in any situation. The histogram is divided up into three imaginary parts, the very far left being the shadows, or the darkest parts, the middle section being the midtones, and the very far right is your highlights, or your bright parts. You want to try to keep all this white information evenly spread out across the chart or in the middle. Too far left is underexposed and too far right is overexposed. Now more advanced cameras may use waveforms instead. This is the same thing, just instead of left to right, it's up and down. The top is the highlights, the middle is the midtones, and the bottom is the shadows. Same principle applies, you want to try to keep all that information in the middle. Now sometimes you're going to have extremely blown out highlights, like a window or the sun. This is okay, just expose for your subject and you will be okay. Now here's how I expose for almost every situation. First, I start with my ISO as low as it can go, around 100 ISO. I check my shutter speed and make sure that it is double my frame rate. In this case, I'm shooting 24 frames a second, so I need to be at 48 shutter speed. I will then take a look at my histogram to determine if my shot is underexposed or overexposed. Using my aperture, I will adjust accordingly. Usually, I will try to keep my aperture as low as it can possibly go. In most indoor shoots, I will always shoot at less than or equal to f2.8. If your lenses don't allow your apertures to go that low, just shoot in as low of an aperture as you can. If at this point my image still doesn't look the way I want it to, I will adjust my ISOs until everything is properly exposed. Now keep in mind, these are just the general rules when it comes to exposure that are made to be broken. For example, your shutter speed doesn't always have to be double your frame rate. However, you should obviously know these rules before you go out and break them. Hope you got something out of this video. Be sure to check out our free filmmaking training to learn more filmmaking tips on how to improve your indie films for the masses. Sign up with the link in the description. We'll see you there.